thanks for joining us for the second video here. So in this video, I'd like to start taking a look at the actual criteria that a founder and a founder startup need to meet in order to qualify for the initial 2.5 years that can be granted on parole. Remember, there's a total of 5 years that's written into the rule, but those are split up into 2.5 year stints. So in the initial I-941 application, we have to prove specific criteria that we'll go over today. And then in the next video, we can take a look at the criteria or milestones that one will have to reach to get this additional 2.5 year re-parole, making up the total of 5 years that can be allocated to any individual entrepreneur looking to be paroled into the US. And in another video, we'll talk about this distinction between being paroled into the US and being admitted as a non-immigrant visa holder, because there are some important distinctions there. Okay, so let's take a look at the basic criteria here. So the rule that is laid out in the regulations focuses on a few key factors. Remember, the overall intention with this program has always been to allow businesses an opportunity to enter the U.S. To operate for growth purposes. Right. So the main focus is on, is this a startup that has the ability to grow into the future? And growth can be revenue growth, it can be job creation, or it can be a combination of those as well. So some of the initial criteria: there has to be a new startup entity at play here. By new, the regulations define this as a startup that has been structured within the last 5 years, or has been set up within the prior 5 years to the time of the actual request for the parole status. So obviously there will need to be documents proving this actual setup. So whether it's a Delaware a corporation, whatever it might be, you have to provide obviously supporting documents proving that. So that should be a relatively straightforward calculation to be done. Then the rules move on to focus on who's a qualified entrepreneur. So an entrepreneur is, there are very specific rules for this. So the Immigration Service wants to see that the entrepreneur is someone who's well positioned to advance the entity's growth or the business entity's goals at the end of the day here. So they've interpreted this, and there were a lot of comments back and forth on this, but they've interpreted this as requiring initially at least a 10% interest that the individual entrepreneur has at the time of adjudication of this initial 2.5 year grant of parole. And that the individual, will be maintaining at least a 5% interest after that moving forward. So again, there's a second re-parole application that can occur after 2.5 years. And just to kind of preview that a little bit, there will have to be a showing that the entrepreneur has at least 5% at that point in time. But for this initial application, there has to be a 10% interest that is proven. In addition to that, they also want us to show that the entrepreneur has an active and central role in the operations of the business, and that you as the entrepreneur, you're going to have an impact on the direction, development, growth of the company. And that, kind of takes us into having to prove up an individual's educational background, skill background, and explain what it is that they're going to be doing that is essentially a critical role within the company. So there are no set educational requirements per se, and this could work without any educational background, but it's going to be a combination of factors. What is it that makes the entrepreneur who's applying for the parole central to the business, and that's something we're going to have to prove up. So there's a little bit of a focus on the individual's background. The O1, which is often an option that that we have looked to because this parole did not exist until now, or at least was not being adjudicated really until now. There's much more of a focus on a claim and proven ability. It's not that kind of in-depth focus here for the parole, but there is certainly an element of that where we will want to play that up in an application, absolutely. So that is the kind of the qualified entrepreneur entrepreneur piece of this puzzle. And then the Immigration Service is going to want to see significant capital investment or government funding that has come into the qualified startup, right? So there's a couple of options here. The first is that within the 18 months immediately preceding the application, the 941 application, that there's been an investment of $250,000 from qualified investors. And we'll take a look at who qualified investors might be in a second. So $250,000 from qualified investors. It can be this can be angel funding, VC funding, funding from individuals, but they have to be qualified investors. $250,000 within the prior 18 months before submitting this application, or it can be a total of $100,000 that have been received through qualified government awards or grants. And these can be accumulated, whether it's qualified, this $250,000 in investment from qualified investors or these grants and awards. They don't have to be one-time awards, but there's going to be this look-back period over 18 months. Okay, so the obvious question is, who qualifies as a qualified investor? So what money can you count? So the rules lay out that individuals or organizations can qualify as qualified investors, but there are very specific rules. So the way that this works is that the Immigration Service is essentially going to assess how often and how successful an investor's investments have been. Okay, so taking a look at the rule here, it specifically states that individual or organizations had to have made investments in startup entities in exchange for equity, convertible debt, or other security convertibles into equity commonly used in financing transactions within that respective industry, and they have to show that they have made investments of no less than $600,000 over a 5-year period. So there's this threshold amount that the investor has to show they've made over 5 years, and in addition to that, they have to show that at least 2 entities into which investments were made have created at least 5 qualified U.S. jobs, or have generated at least $500,000 in revenue as a result of those investments into the entities, and that this revenue has to be annualized at least to 20% annual growth. So there's a couple of criteria that the officer is going to look at here to see if an investor is a qualified investor, but at its base level, we have to show that these investors have made investments totaling at least $600,000 over the past 5 years, and that these investments have led to or have generated the creation of at least 5 U.S. jobs, or $500,000 in revenues, with at least 20% annualized growth in those companies over time. So this is going to become a critical issue, certainly in these applications. We will likely get a sense as the Immigration Service adjudicates these 941 applications, kind of what their questions may be, but obviously, hitting these criteria as laid out per the regulations should enable one to qualify for a grant of parole. I will note that the investment criteria is a way for the government to essentially see that the your startup business has the potential to grow into the future. So they're almost using these investors as a form of due diligence. So if we can prove these are qualified investors that that make these investments often, then the Immigration Service is taking the approach that, well, these are qualified investors. This is what they do. They must have done their due diligence, and so that is essentially going to help show or make the officer more comfortable with your particular startup entity. Now, they may certainly ask more questions, and I would certainly expect them to. But that's kind of a very solid baseline, and we have to satisfy these requirements. It's also worth noting that whether one satisfies the 250,000 from qualified investors or the 100,000 in government grants or awards. And these grants or awards, we need to show that these are coming from government entities that have specific expertise in economic development, research, and job creation. So there will need to be some proof provided there. But even for entities that do not hit that $250,000 mark from qualified investors or 100,000 from government grants or awards, there is this alternative criteria built in where one can show that you've partially satisfied these investment thresholds, and that you have other reliable evidence that the officer can use to show or for the officer to feel that allowing the entrepreneur to be paroled into the U.S. still has significant public benefit to the country as a whole. So it's not that there's no way that one can be paroled into the U.S. if you haven't met these thresholds yet. But it seems like, and again, we'll see as these cases are adjudicated more frequently, it seems that there is this other option. I'm assuming it's going to be much easier to satisfy if you hit the thresholds, but there is still an argument to be made if you're a little bit short. How short is yet to be seen. Okay, so again, as a quick recap for this initial 2.5-year parole period, some of the basic criteria are that there must be a new startup entity within the last 5 years, that one has to be a qualified entrepreneur. That means you have at least 10% at the time of adjudication for the initial 2.5-year application. Again, that can drop down to no less than 5% moving forward after that. But you have the 10%, and you also have an active role with this startup, and that your skills or experience or background are needed and will play a pivotal role in the growth and acceleration of the startup. And then also there's this significant U.S. investment criteria, which the officers, again, are kind of using as a way to do some due diligence through qualified investors or government entities. And then there's this this catch-all or carve-out where you could maybe still qualify if you don't hit all the full 250,000 in qualified investment or 100,000 in government funding. Okay, so those are the basics of the initial 2.5-year grant. In the next video, we'll take a look at some of the additional requirements that will need to be satisfied and thresholds that will need to be met when one is looking to be re-paroled for another 2.5 years down the line. Thank you so much for watching the video. Hopefully this was helpful. Please subscribe to get additional updates, and never hesitate to reach out to us at ImmiPartner, and we look forward to helping you. We're very excited about this program, and we hope you are too.